special place.
The name steel guitar often puzzles observers confronted with a wooden instrument. It derives, of course, from the method of playing, having the guitar horizontal and sliding a bar of metal, termed as steel, up and down the strings, to produce the characteristic glissando or dinner's an hour late sound. Nowadays the bar seems to be called a slide. Legends abound about the discovery or invention of the Hawaiian style of playing, but the most votes go to one Joseph Kaluku, who first used a railroad fang bolt on the strings of his guitar, liked the sound, and developed it using his penknife as a steel. Don't worry, this story isn't going to be about how I found an old penknife that turned out to be Joe Kaluku's original steel, nor shall I take advantage of the Freudian school of analysis that would undoubtedly read much into the phallic shape of the steel, particularly the bullet-nosed ones. I have not discovered a fossilized penis in use as a slide, though the right one would doubtless constitute an amulet of dark powers. Nothing is more crucial to the serious player of steel guitar than the choice of an appropriate steel. Weight, balance, and toughness of the shiny plating, which gives the smoothness of the notes, are critical. Most players find one that suits them and stick with it. Obviously you try to keep a spare or two against catastrophic loss, but steels seldom change hands. Having found the correct one for your style, it is too precious to be parted from. Which makes it all the more surprising that my own favourite was given to me by the brilliant and innovative American country music player Speedy West. Of course, it wasn't his everyday bar, but a spare. Nevertheless, the privilege was immense. It's a cylindrical roller type, slightly longer than average at 4 inches, and 3/4 of an inch in diameter, one end being rounded or bullet-nosed as we call it. Speedy West is engraved long ways in 2 places, this providing a slight roughing of the polished surface, exactly right for holding. When I first used it on an electric guitar, I made an odd discovery. I found to my amazement that I was thinking, and not only thinking but playing too, in phrasing typical of West's ebullient style. It actually took a great deal of effort not to play like him. I put this strange effect down to the fact that the steel was genuine ferrous metal, magnetic and thoroughly soaked, saturated, as it were, with the electrical patterns his style of playing had created across the strings, in the magnetic fields set up by the pole pieces of the electric pickups. Unfortunately, the effect wore off after a while, though it lasted long enough to demonstrate the phenomenon to a couple of other players of my acquaintance. I live on the East Coast in one of the more sheltered towns. In summer there's often evening work. I'm an industrial chemist by day, providing dance or Hawaiian music at the seafront hotels and other auditoria. Sometimes, if Mitch Samuels is short of a steel player, I join one of the tours of his Hawaiian serenaders when they come to the East Coast. Occasionally, in winter too, I succumb to the lure of a few nights' cabaret inland with his regulars. I'm a solitary individual by nature, not needing company, and content to potter along at my own speed. One of my pastimes is beachcombing, picking up any likely flotsam and jetsam that ends up on the shore. There's one particular spot, just above the golf course, where the cliffs are gradually crumbling away, that seems to concentrate tide-borne spoil, and that's known only to myself. At least I seem to get first refusal of what the sea has left on offer. Quite profitable it is, too, sometimes, and bizarre at others. There are many stories I could tell of strange finds, but it's one in particular that I have in mind now. It was early autumn, and there was a relatively calm spell, so I wasn't expecting to find much on my routine visit. I dragged above the tide mark a plastic milk crate. Then, in moving a pile of wrack, sea holly, and thongweed, I stubbed my finger on a rusty bolt of some kind, sticking out of the damp sand. To my amusement, it looked rather like a guitar steel that had lost its plating after years of immersion in sea water and begun to corrode slowly. My find was very similar to the Speedy West steel, being about 4 inches long and the same diameter as the latter. It was clearly quite old, probably unalloyed bronze, and was hollowed out like a section of pipe. There was a neck, or mouthpiece, at one end, so it might have been a pitch pipe or something of that nature. In view of its evident antiquity, I thought it would make an interesting spare steel, should I ever lose either of my others. There was a further resemblance to the West steel, in that it too had some engraving or design that facilitated finger grip. However, it was far too worn and etched by seawater to determine whether these were simply tooling marks, a pattern, or even an inscription. I cleaned it up in the lab and burnished it on the lathe. It was clearly bronze, and not a true pipe as such, for the hollowing was slightly off-centre, clearly the handiwork of a long-deceased artisan. There seemed no allowance in the design for a reed, just a lip, so it was fixed to a single note, if indeed it was a pitch pipe of sorts. I had no intention of blowing it. Quite the contrary. I was going to fill it with solder, to add weight for playing. In fact, I filled it with lead shot, and simply soldered up the ends, one of which I turned on the lathe to give a bullet nose. I decided against plating. The polished bronze finish would give a rasping effect that might be suitable for some types of Western music, or special effects like, horrors, bagpipes. Rather than going to the trouble of fixing up the electric guitar, I tried my new steel on an acoustic instrument. It did indeed have a satisfyingly rough, scratchy sound, so into my music case it went, kept separate in a small individual purse like the other two. I thought very little more about it. A few months later, more or less out of the blue, I got a telegram from Mitch asking me to deputise at a cabaret do for his regular steelist, who had sprained his wrist. It was short notice, and I had a bit of a rush to get the trains to the north, since there were several changes to be made. The serenaders had been engaged to provide cabaret at some Caledonian supper, and why on earth the Scots wanted Hawaiian cabaret was beyond me. Still, there it was. I got there with about half an hour to spare. The cabaret went well. The girl dancers were well received, and we had a few merry volunteers to dance the hula with our South Sea lovelies, mostly from London actually, donning raffia skirts over their kilts or trews. Then Mitch made a mistake. He gave the audience, by now becoming somewhat mellow with whisky, a version of Loch Lomond in our Hawaiian style. After that we were expected to carry on the Scottish theme. Any attempt to divert from Annie Laurie, Comin' Through the Rye, Bonnie Mary of Argyll, etc., was howled down by the increasingly noisy and tearful Scots. In an effort to end the session, I swung into Auld Lang Syne, but that only made matters worse. Mitch was worried about getting the girls and ourselves away. "What on earth do we do?" he whispered. "Tell you what," I said, "I'll do a bagpipe impression on the guitar, lead into 'We're 100 Pipers,' and you get ready to take a line of dancers out of the hall, okay?" "Worth a try," he nodded, and spoke swiftly to the rest of the ensemble. I reached in my case for the new bronze steel. It should do the job nicely, I thought. I turned up the volume control, got ready to roll the foot pedal to swell, and gripping the steel firmly, did a powerful glissando up the strings, trying to make it skirl like the pipes. It certainly produced an effect. I'd never heard anything like the unearthly banshee shriek that swept out of the speaker, and it froze the audience, just as the lights went out. They came on again, rather dimly, and in the uncanny stillness that lasted for almost tangible seconds, we all heard the wind suddenly rise to gale force outside. The emergency exit doors were blown violently inward. Everyone turned to the doors and, in the uncertain light, saw a huge and dripping mass of what looked like seaweed blown into the hall. We all put down our instruments, and I stood, still holding the steel, as the lights went out again. I had a torch in my case, being quite used to lodging houses where the lights were turned off by the landlady, and its beam showed the mass flowing down the hall towards me. The audience, dancers and staff, parting with shrieks of horror and stampeding madly for the open door and out into the night. The weed engulfed us on the stage, but then seemed to lose its momentum, and we found ourselves struggling to get free of a twisted mess of bladder rack, knotted rack, and such, our nostrils filled with the seaside odour that wet seaweed imparts. Whether that freak gale had simply animated the mass and carried it along the hall, no one could say, but we lost no time in kicking it all to one side, brushing ourselves down, and making for our rendezvous in the railway station. One by one, our frightened dancers turned up, and we all spent a rather miserable night in the waiting room until the 4:30 a.m. train. Inevitably, we found we'd left a few things behind, and Mitch and I volunteered to return to the hall to try and find them. The wind was still raging about, though nothing like the furious blast that had flung open the doors and admitted the seaweed. The hall was a mess of overturned tables, broken crockery, and glasses and bottles. The weed had seemingly gone, or been carried outside by the cleaners, who were trying to restore order. The police had arrived, and we gathered that the hospital was doing a roaring trade in minor injuries. We had a few words with the management and the police, who seemed to put it all down to the effects of storm damage, and then hunted out our remaining belongings, including the steel I had dropped while struggling with the weed. I showed it to Mitch, and to my surprise he recoiled somewhat. "Sorry," he said. "It gives me a queer feeling, that's all. I don't like it. If I were you, I'd chuck it away. Back into the sea, preferably." "Seems a waste," I said, "especially as we don't know what it is. It might be valuable, especially if there's an inscription there." "Well," he said slowly, "it might be worth trying to see, but I still think you should chuck it away." And with that we busied ourselves with the rest of our bits and pieces before trudging back to the railway station. "I hope you were paid," I said. He grinned. "Oh yes, we're well enough known to demand cash in advance, but it's definitely one to chalk up to experience." I was not in any condition to do much work next day, after the long, dreary journey home, and I still had the smell of the seaweed in my nostrils, and could feel again the unpleasant, rubbery, gelatinous tendrils of wrack heaped against me. Then I thought of the bronze steel. I put it under the ultraviolet lamp to see if the remnants of any design or patterning could be visualized from their ghostly remains, though my previous turning and polishing had all but removed the last traces. To my surprise, however, some marks were discernible in the eerie blue glow. With increasing exposure they became a trifle clearer, and could be identified as square-cut letters spelling out words of some sort. On one side, if indeed a cylinder has sides, there was a longish group of letters, and on the opposite a small pattern of similar marks. As I wrote them out, they made what seemed like Latin words. Maybe I had found a Roman soldier's penny whistle. Back at my solitary home I pondered what to do. The memory of that deafening shriek and what had followed was getting on my nerves. If this nervous uncertainty was the result of having blown the pipe, at least electronically, I was beginning to be sorry. Was I going mad, too? Who was it that had come dressed in seaweed? Well, there was only one way to find out, and that was to try the steel on the electric guitar once again. But up to now I hadn't dared. Suppose... Addendum by Mitchell Samuels, musical and variety agent. Mr. Green, the author of this note, was a dependable sessions player. His failure to keep a prearranged appointment caused concern. Subsequent investigations have failed to produce any information as to his present whereabouts.
Pua